So welcome, Mark Gabriel. How you doing?
I'm good, brother. What's going on with you?
Good, good. I'm doing well. Lots going on. As usual, I'm busy and I know you're running around real busy. So I'm here with Mark Gabriel, is many things, musician, artist, and among other things, television developer, different things. I, the purpose of this podcast is to talk about music specifically. You're a musician and our musical influences and so on. But just before we get started, do you want to tell listeners a bit about yourself?
Yeah. Well, it all like all the stuff that we'll get to. I'm sure we'll get to a lot of it today, even though the focus is the music stuff. For me, it all comes from the same place. So, you know, I'm kind of an idea, kind of sparky, kind of generator kind of person, and so sometimes those things come out as visual expression, and I need to kind of paint them or maybe think about graphic novels or for for like you were saying, the better part of my life, my career was in film, um, as production designer, um, which came from the visual side of what I do, illustration. I went to school for illustration, and they're all all the things are connected, and it just sort of depends on the idea that sort of comes to me on a certain day, how it gets executed. Is it a 3 minute pop song, or is it something else? And sometimes that's the fun part, trying to just determine what that is, how I'm going to spend my time. Um, and sometimes it's super frustrating. But yeah, man, I've been an artist my whole life. It's sort of, it's hard to call yourself an artist when you're young. It sounds kind of pretentious, but when I
Yeah.
can number the things that I'm definitely not. It took me more about figuring out what I'm not, what I definitely can't do in this life, and so it was a conclusion that I came to, fairly early. That's kind of what I am and what I do. And so yeah, I've been a professional visual artist and musician, um, for
Long
yeah,
time.
for a long time, since I've known you, man. You were, I think, pretty much my first friend.
Yeah, no, that's something I wanted just to mention a little bit, but I
Yeah.
want to I should
Full
we tell
disclosure, we know
listeners,
each
yeah,
other pretty.
this is not a random happenstance. So just before I want to get back to what you said in just a minute, but listeners should understand that Mark and I have known each other what 45 years, 40 years, something really long time.
I mean, our
Yeah,
houses were there was
two
one
houses
house in
apart.
between our houses.
Yeah. So when we were kids, we would go play together. Back in I guess it seems like the way we grew up is now kids don't grow up that way. Like we would just kind of go out in the streets and walk around and just play stuff. And now things are way more organized. We were always kind of running around in the schoolyard and doing things and right,
I mean,
Uh,
that's the joke, right? When the street lights come on, you
yeah,
go home. But
right.
even then,
My mom used to tell me that, yeah, when the lights come on, you got to come home. Okay, So we've known each
I don't
other
know if you
since.
remember my
Go ahead.
dad blowing that weird trumpet. You remember
Oh,
that? He had this. It wasn't a trumpet. It was a giant horn that was like a. It was like a.
kind of like an
I
Alpenhorn or something. Not
Yeah,
quite that big.
yeah. He would stand on the back deck when he couldn't find us, or couldn't call it. We were out of range. He would blow this thing, and it was it was like the whole neighborhood
Oh
had
man,
time for us to go home.
that's hilarious. Yeah, that's something that's happened since because just for listeners to understand. So we grew up together, and then as we got into our teenage years, I think we went to different schools and stuff. You were at Malvern. We grew up in
Yeah.
Toronto, both of us, and that's where we're from. And anyway, and then at some point we kind of separated, and then I went to a different school at one point, and then you went to a different one, and we kind of diverged.
Yeah.
And we stayed in contact, and then when I was about 18 or 19, I took off and came to Montreal, and I've been here ever since. And so that,
Yeah.
but we've been back in touch on and off over the years. But anyway, it's just listeners should understand that we're not strangers. Let's put it that way, right?
Yeah, no, there's a history, and also a pretty big musical one too, which
Yeah.
which
Yes.
started really. Us. Yeah.
Yes, good. That's I want to get to that, but I just wanted to comment a little bit on what you said. It's very interesting. So it sounds like you have something like an inspiration of some kind, like you sense something and you got, I want to express this thing. And then after you have that, what is it, like a feeling, you have to go and figure out, am I gonna paint this? Am I gonna, how am I gonna bring this into the world? Almost like you're giving birth or something. I'm a lamb, I'm
Yeah.
embellishing here, but it sounded like it's like a sensation of some kind or something. Is that a way to describe it? I'm not sure if I understood.
It's a lot more specific or visceral than just, I mean, it's I mean, I think when David Lynch talked about, his transcendental process going down to the lake, I don't know if we'll get into
Maybe you
that,
could
but
tell listeners. I know David Lynch, but I'm not familiar with that. Maybe you could just recount
he
that.
well, he would talk about when he was on looking for ideas, specifically, hunting or fishing for ideas in his world. He gets into he's into transcendental meditation, and he has been for a long time. And the way he describes it is descending into down to a lake that is I mean, deep in the earth kind of lake. And for him, it's a very physical thing. I don't know if he actually feels like he's getting wet or if that's even important, but the idea is that this lake is where these ideas are. He basically fishes for them, and so, I mean, I can kind of relate. I'm not as much into meditation, or at least as disciplined as a transcendentalist, but I could tell you that the ideas feel as solid as pulling a
A
fish out
fish.
of
Yeah,
yeah,
like it actually has weight. Like you can feel it
yeah.
as you're getting at it or something.
You smell it,
Yeah.
yeah, and
So it's physical. There's a
it's
physical
very
aspect.
physical, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
it can be super dramatic, like you said, like giving birth. I mean, that's pretty dramatic. Or it can
Yeah.
be just something's tickling your toes or whatever, while you're standing in the water. But it's like, determining what that is, and it's an idea, it's a creative impulse. It's and again, for me, it's not necessarily, I mean, I'm using the fish thing, but because it's a good way to describe it, but it's for me, it's like a channeling, right? It is like being
Right.
open to whatever, artists have talked about it that way too. You just you're open to the cosmos or whatever, and the channels open and stuff just comes through,
Yeah.
and I've been like that my whole life, and figuring out how,
How to access it and use it and
yeah,
channel it and all that, right?
and
That's
then how to
part of it.
execute what those things are, because they're literally like, I mean, a fish, you know what a fish is. When I tell you, you could probably picture what that is. But when it's a when it's an idea, a creative idea, it's not necessarily as formed, even though it's we were saying it is very kind of physical. It doesn't feel ethereal in that way. It feels like heavy sometimes, like big, but you
Right.
don't know what it is. And so determining what it is a big part of, for me, the fun part of the creative process. Like I said, mostly fun. Sometimes it's super frustrating, figuring out what it is. And you can go in, down a certain path and realize, yeah, this is not a 3 minute pop song. This has to be,
Right.
this would be kind of prose, 300-page prose or something.
It's really interesting because the way you're describing this, it makes me think. We use the word creativity for artists. So it's sort of like we imagine an artist sort of make something out of nothing. But the way you're describing it, it's like these things are somewhere in the world in some almost like another dimension or something, right?
Yeah,
And you're
that's what it
kind of like
feels
they
like.
have to kind of come up and touch you, or and then you can get at them, and then it's not, creativity is almost like a discovery. The way you describe, the way I'm understanding what you're saying. I don't know if that is accurate.
Yeah, no, it is accurate. I mean, there's a part of me that feels like, um, I don't want to take all that credit for this thing.
Yeah.
There's,
I'm not
there's
that
a,
good.
right. But
Right.
and not just because I don't want to appear, not humble and a little bit, like egotistical, but also because it does, when the process has worked out great, I'm as surprised by what has
Yeah.
materialized as,
Yeah.
as the next person, who didn't have any involvement in the creation of it. So it's kind of a magical process in that way. And also, I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but also the other part of it is, if you don't act on those things, which I think is the artist's original sin, to not act on your creative inspiration impulse and do the thing that's been divine to you in whatever way, it'll show up for somebody else. And every
Yeah.
artist has a version of that, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, I didn't do that, and you fucking come up with that a couple years later,
You robbed me.
same thing,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like they're out there, these things are out there, and it's, and it doesn't have to, I mean, I'm talking in kind of maybe sort of psychobabbly, spiritually kind of a way. That's just sort of how I process the thing. But it's, it's also, it's very much related to the input,
Yeah.
which is also a huge part, obviously, of the creative process is what's happening in the world, what
Mm.
things you're letting into you. Are you watching certain shows, reading certain things? Wars
Collective
are going.
consciousness in some senses, right?
Yeah,
There's
totally.
right.
Yeah. So maybe, yeah, it's a bit of that collective consciousness thing, right? Where we're all getting fed this thing, and there's only so many ways to process that information. Maybe there's 1,000, maybe there's 1,000,000 ways, but there's
But there's
a
only
lot more.
only a few coherent ways, right?
Yeah.
There
And
are millions of ways to organize anything. I mean, like if you took a bookshelf and wanted to
yeah,
organize books, you could literally, there are almost an infinite number of different ways. You could do them by size, you could do them alphabetically, but if you were to make a coherent, there's only so many ways that are really kind of coherent, that really kind of work, right?
yeah.
So that's
Well, I
your
mean,
job,
that's
is
that's the
finding one of
question, isn't
those,
it?
right?
I mean, that's the question. And every artist, and I think this is what makes art amazing, is that every artist or every creative person, um, which is a distinction that we can talk about later, but we'll get impulses, could get everyone, you take 4 or 5 people in the same room getting the same impulses, and they're all going to express it differently. And that's for
Right.
me
Yeah.
the joy of it, and also the savior, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but when you get into those dark spaces where it's like, what's the point of the whole thing? Does anybody care? No one bought that last record I put out.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Self.
the thing that keeps you going, and ultimately, right? It's all been done before. We've all heard it
Yeah.
before. You know,
Yeah.
the answer is the thing that gets you up in the morning and and into the studio is that no one's heard your version of that yet.
Yeah.
So
And a little bit of what you're describing too is a little bit of insecurity. You don't want to think, you want to be like, God, I don't know if I'm really good enough, because I'm hearing a lot of self-doubt, which is not a bad thing, right? There's a tension. You want to be confident you can bring something to the world and do something well, but you don't want to have hubris or be arrogant. And you want to also think, is this really good? Are people going to like this? Do I like
I
this?
mean, I think that's important. I don't know. Some artists really, they blow me away with their hubris. They're
Yeah.
really sure of themselves. I mean, I look at like Henry Rollins, and I know he can be self-depreciating too, but that I sort of go, how do you have such confidence like talking like that? But it's amazing. It's amazing. I
He
mean,
is exceptional. I mean, Henry Rollins can do so many
yeah,
things. So, I mean, if I was
yeah.
as exceptional as him, maybe I would be arrogant too, right? Because
Hmm.
I mean, okay.
Yeah,
Listen, that this is really, really interesting. I do have a feeling we could probably we should definitely return to this as we have our conversations.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah, because this is a really, really deep theme. We started off with this heavy duty thing, which is great, but let's in a future talk. Just on a side note for our listeners, I'm hoping at some point to. Mark lives in Mexico. For anyone listening, in lower Baja California, and so at some point I plan to go out and visit just for a vacation. So we plan to do a in-person one. I was thinking if I do that, we could do the art one, because I'll be seeing your art, right? I'll be like, I mean,
That would
I'll
be
be
great.
physically
Yeah.
seeing it, right? Which would be great. I've seen you. You're a very good artist. I really liked your the stuff I've seen in your galleries.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, but let's get to the music. So
Yeah.
we both, grew up we're almost identical in age, almost down to the day, right? We're both Generation Xers, born in 72. I think both in April, right? We're like 8 days apart or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have like almost an identical, and we grew up in the same place and kind of the same influences. So just to describe to our listeners, the 1980s, I suppose late 70s, you know, we had different family backgrounds, but we both were my parents at least were all into like the sort of 60s stuff, like the baby boomer rock and roll of, you know, the Beatles and the Rolling
Yeah.
Stones and the you know the Rod Stewart, like really really good stuff. But it was clear to me, I don't know if you had this sense that it was not us, all that stuff. It was like, and so something I just want you to talk a little bit about was when on my 12th birthday, my brother, shout out to CJ McDonald of San Francisco,
Yeah.
California, he got us tickets for all of us, for you and me, to go see the Clash. So this is
Yeah.
1984, Maple Leaf Gardens, Toronto, Canada. It was a combat rock tour, right? So
Yeah.
we went to
Yeah.
this thing, and boy, that was a fucking amazing show. It was the first big stadium show I'd ever seen.
So
And
did we determine was that 83 or 84? Is that you?
I
That's
think
12. You
it's
were 12,
84.
right?
We could confirm that. I'm pretty sure it was my 12th birthday. My brother was in
I'm pretty sure
secondary
too.
school at Malvern, and you and I guess we were, I don't know, at Balmy Beach or wherever we were, Spectrum or something. I can't remember. But anyway, I think it was my 12th birthday. Might have been
Yeah.
13. But anyway,
No, I think 12 makes sense.
yeah, because it feels like after that, as I remember that after that, the Clash kind of blew in supernova. They came back with that English, whatever it was, This Is England or whatever it was a few years later.
Yeah,
But
well, my understanding is that actually, and this came later, was that Mick Jones actually wasn't on that tour, or he didn't
oh,
make the show in
okay,
Toronto. Yeah,
interesting.
so it was Joe Strummer, and I mean, I think,
All the others,
yeah, that,
Topper Head On, and right, all the
yeah,
yeah, the fantastic drummer. I mean, because the Clash. I mean, one thing I've learned to appreciate more as an adult is just how incredibly amazing they are musically. I
yeah,
mean, you
yeah,
know, just absolutely sharp. And you know, they didn't know how to do anything. I don't know if you know
yeah,
this about them. They saw the Sex Pistols and then they sort of picked up a guitar. Apparently, that happened
yeah,
in England at that time. Everyone saw the Sex Pistols and so they learned how to play like in like a year, just like, you know, and then they turned into this incredible band. But you told me
I
that
yeah, I
show
do know
was,
that about them.
yeah,
And I have to say that just quickly that defined also my musical career, that aesthetic, that because I wasn't necessarily a punk rocker, although the Clash changed my world. That concert, changed my whole world. But it's the punk ethos, the do it yourself thing
yeah,
that
yeah,
really made it okay
yeah.
for me to become a musician, to start
What
doing it.
I
Yeah,
love that. You see, so this is around when we were that age. I got so the Clash. I was into the Clash and the Sex Pistols, and I was really into some of these other bands that were like from California. I don't know, like Dead Kennedys and stuff like that, that kind of thing. And that was
yeah,
all built into the punk movement. Effectively, was from what I can understand about it was because you know, but by the 70s there was all these sort of slick progressive rock music had become much more formulaic in a certain sense because it had, you know, it was less you know, pushing the boundaries and more how do we sell this album and sort of whatever, right? So you had Pink Floyd, and I mean a lot of good music was made under that rubric, but the punk movement seemed to be, and you know, it was also very professionalized, right? It was these sort of progressive rock guitarists who were these virtuosos or whatever, you know, right? And the punk movement seemed to be saying that that's a bunch of bullshit, you know, that if you can learn how to play guitar and you can have a certain sound that's you, right? You can be you and you can learn how to, like what you were describing earlier about bringing every artist bringing something to the world, right?
yeah, yeah,
So anyway, I don't know if you, because you told me that that show was transformative for you, and it was,
yeah.
I mean, an amazing show. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, or I don't know. It was a great show.
I mean, well, Maple Leaf Gardens, right? And that would be, a sad day when that place was torn down or, decommissioned as a concert venue. But I mean, that was my first big rock show. I have to admit that I think before that I may have seen Olivia Newton-John with my family at
That's
not CNE Stadium, but there's the Varsity Stadium at CNE, the smaller stadium.
okay.
And
Yeah.
we were big, my family, we were big music. We loved musicals and stuff. As a little kid, I was super into, South Pacific and Fiddler on the Roof and so when Grease came along, it was sort of a huge thing for us as kids. And so, yeah, but really the Clash, like, it shook me out of, it really started me down the path of what kind of music, touched me, and not just, was through osmosis of being in a musical family, and,
Right.
um, so, and also, being a kid, I mean, I was fairly sheltered, middle classy kind of, good neighborhood and stuff. I felt like there's some real danger, you know.
Transgression sounds like, right? Yeah,
Yeah, and
something like
and I
that.
think that that really shook me right down to the
Foundations.
innards.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, it engaged me, and I wouldn't revisit it like in wholeheartedly probably until more like high school, which I guess is just a few years later. But
At that
um,
age, that's a big difference, right? 2 years,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, huge, huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was always been like a pop guy, like you know, besides the musicals and stuff, I was always like Beach Boys, and my mom was she loved Elvis, and Harry Belafonte, and so
That's
I
all
was kind of,
amazingly good stuff though, man.
oh
Elvis.
yeah, totally, no, totally.
Yeah.
Really, it's
Yeah.
it's set it's set within me like a real strong uh pull towards music that had melody, harmony, those pop hooks.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so even so even with the Clash, obviously, like, I didn't go as deep into the punk thing at the time that you did, because for me it was definitely, there was a songwriting element that I really, the Clash, for me, always had this poppiness, or this, I don't know, singability. There's this like thing about it, but it still felt super, yeah, dangerous, and like,
Transgressive.
not, this is not your mother's record collection anymore, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying because like we both had musical backgrounds. My father actually is a musician. He's a professional musician, as you
Yeah,
know. And
yeah,
although and my mom was an artist and so on, but there was a slight generational difference between our families. Your father was a little bit older, right? And I believe
I
your
guess
mother
so.
might have been, right. So what you're describing is like the music they were listening to was more from the 50s, right? La
Yeah,
Belafonte and my parents, it was all 60s rock and roll, kind of like the Beatles on kind of thing, right? So
yeah,
in our
interesting. Yeah,
homes we had different backgrounds there, and I don't know why I dive harder into the punk thing. Maybe I needed to define myself more from my family or something, but it's interesting. Maybe yours was less, what you're describing would have been less, not less known, but all that stuff, I think like the Belafonte and all that would have seemed really old. I think even in the
for
80s,
sure.
right? Whereas like
Yeah,
the Beatles and the Stones still wouldn't, I mean, they would have been old too, but not the same. They would have felt more kind of current, I think. If I'm just trying to remember what it felt like in those days, right?
I mean, I remember you and me standing by your front gate. Because you lived on the big house on the corner, which is
Yeah.
a super cool lot. Remember being at the front gate on Lyle Avenue and singing like Joan Jett
Oh
and
yeah, I love rock and roll.
I Love Rock and Roll. Yeah, I remember, and we even had a
Right,
conversation. I don't remember if it was you or me. One of us would never wear shorts, or maybe neither of us did because we had to wear jeans. And
right, right.
we were talking about, we were singing that song. I remember singing like Another One Bites the Dust. Anything with like, there's
I
like,
remember that. I remember
yeah,
the singing that. Yeah, yeah, and that was
yeah,
a huge hit. Devo was that was a big hit, right?
yeah, yeah. So, the catchy things to this day, kick drum, hand claps, acoustic
Yeah,
guitar, multiple voices singing something like choruses, or even
background
bar kind
vocals.
of.
Yeah, yeah,
It just like, it goes right to the, right to the core of me. That you can catch me real easy, with hooks like that.
sure.
Bass
Well,
lines. Yeah,
what you're describing too is, I mean, a good pop song. There's you could make a list of certain things, and you've listed them, most of them. It's a couple of minutes, right? 2, 3 minutes. You
yeah,
mentioned earlier in the podcast. You sometimes hand clapping is so cool.
yeah,
In a pop song, right? You've got background chorus vocals, right?
yeah,
You've got 16 bar usually if you're getting more technical, right? To go to usually they're 16 bar, right? I should
Right.
also mention that I also played music. You're a musician. We should tell
Yes.
listeners you're a bass player, right?
So yeah, before I even could admit that I was a musician, because I still to this day have, insecurities about being, lacking music theory and all that stuff. Again, kind of coming from the Clash, the
Yeah.
do-it-yourself kind of like just doing it kind of thing, and I don't even know what these chords are called kind of thing. So but before I could call myself a musician, I definitely could call myself a bass player because
Right,
that's
right.
I picked it
Because
up
you
and
knew how to play, right? You played,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, and I did,
Right, yeah.
as of high
Right.
school, I was playing bass in bands that were playing around the city, so
Right.
maybe not making a lot of money, but as far as I was concerned, I was a bass player in a band, even as
Well,
a
that makes you a
teenager. So
musician, in my view, right?
yeah,
Yeah, more than
certainly. I
me,
mean,
right? I
so
played drums and I played bass, but I never played in clubs or anything. So I mean, right? You
yeah,
know,
yeah. No, but I'm just saying it's sort of like for me, like it, because again, in that scene playing with a bunch of other mostly older bands who are kicking ass, and can, can play whatever. I mean, and I felt like kind of that imposter syndrome, but what
right?
I could say, even at the end of the
Yeah.
night, even if my band sucked as the opening band or whatever, that I'm a bass player.
Mhm.
Eventually that became songwriter as well, and I sort of became more comfortable as a just calling myself a musician. But yeah, at my core, the instrument that really is me is the bass for sure.
Why is that? What is it about it?
I don't know, man. It seems really
I love the bass.
maybe,
I played bass
yeah.
too, you know.
I think this might I'm just sort of riffing here, but this goes to also my painting. But I'm really, as an artist, I'm really into limitations, and like when I paint, if I can reduce my palette down to 3 or 4 colors,
Ah,
uh,
interesting.
I-
Yeah.
you know, and still say what I want to say with that. Again, and Lou Reed, with chords and stuff. Lou Reed's, what's his quote about jazz? One chord good, 2 chords, you know, okay, 3 chords jazz.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's
And it
a
was
what
like,
is it? The rock musician plays, two what is it? Two he knows two is it chords, right? E and whatever.
yeah,
And then and
yeah,
plays in front of 20 million people, and the jazz musician knows 20 million chords and plays in front of two people or something like that. Is that
yeah, right.
right? Something like that, right?
I
So
mean, I'm definitely not putting it down, but I gravitate towards those kinds of things, those drones, those 1, 2 chord, 3 chord things, and don't overcomplicate it if you don't have to. I mean, if it takes you 18, 20 chords to tell a story, then do it, But I think for me, and
it's
this
not
comes back to
you.
your question about the bass, there's limitations to the bass. I mean, at least for me, I mean, the 4 strings, you can play chords, you can play all kinds of styles on it, but um, it seems slightly more limited than a guitar.
I think it
And
objectively is.
yeah,
Putting chords on a bass is almost impossible. And I think you can do it, but
well,
a guitar, you can play, you can pluck a guitar like a bass if you want to, but you don't have
yeah,
to.
you
You can
you can.
strum a guitar. A guitar has more strings, literally, so there's actually fewer strings on a bass typically. They're right.
Yeah.
And
I mean, you're asking a question that I'm kind of answering intellectually, and really, when we get
it's a
down to
heart
the
thing. It's a soul sense that you like it more,
really is.
right?
I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
that would be my first answer when I have to try to articulate something, but really, it just feels good. Feels really good to me. I feel comfortable. When you're in the right automobile, you've come to
Right.
the right
Yeah.
party. When you're in the wrong party and in the wrong car. You just know it. And to me, the bass just feels so good in my hands, and I can say things with it. I can sort of express myself with it better than the guitar. And I've been playing, guitar a little longer than the bass. I learned a few chords at some point back then. Someone taught me, but back in high school. But I realized, pretty quickly that the bass was just my jam.
Yeah. So that you're describing again a kind of a sensation. I mean, if ever I were to go back to playing music, me, it's definitely the drums. you know.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that,
Yeah,
man.
I played drums for a few years, and like when I listened, I don't know if this maybe was because I played drums, but all of the music I listen to is very similar to what you're describing. It's very sort of a lot of it's drone like and everything, but I like really bass and rhythm heavy music. I love a lot of
Yeah.
reggae, and I love a lot of
Yeah.
Caribbean musics and African music and really
Yeah.
rock and roll. Like I love the kind of hard, kind of Rolling Stones, kind of like harder, more deep feeling music and not complicated stuff. Like not the,
Yeah.
So it sounds like we have a similar musical sensibility just in terms of how we approach, the enjoyment of music, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is I think music should be a gut thing, and
Yeah.
it's funny. I was just thinking about this today, and talking to you about, I was thinking, about various questions you're going to ask me and influences stuff. And I came across David Bowie and, in my sort of floating in there in the lists of my favorite artists,
Right. Right.
and although Bowie would definitely be in the top 15, top 10, maybe, um, I I don't connect with Bowie emotionally. Like
Interesting.
I
Interesting.
love I can go whole days, weeks on a Bowie kick and like get into it and like a lot of things. I get obsessed with stuff and I can listen to albums. When they're over, I put the needle back to the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah, I do
You
that
know,
over and over again.
right?
Yeah,
And I can do
yeah,
that with Bowie, like with any of them. But emotionally, like I just, it's not it, viscerally. It just isn't. It doesn't connect like other things do for me. And it
interesting.
reminds me of like as an intellectual, which I slip into. Um, I
You have a brain and you know how to talk.
Yeah, yeah, but I
Yeah,
can
right.
appreciate music on an
Yeah,
intellectual level, right? Where it's not visceral and it's not, and I'm interested in something. I'm really interested in how people are expressing themselves, and not just interested, but really invested. But there's a difference when it really hits you on a guttural kind of level, when it really just, when it speaks to you. And I don't trust people that haven't had those experiences,
yeah.
and I met a few of them, where like they'll put some music on and it's like, oh, you like this? And like, yeah, well, it's music or whatever. It makes you dance. And it's like, wow, you know, um, it's like you've never been in love, dude.
Yeah,
But anyway,
yeah, yeah. You got to feel it,
it's
right?
it
Yeah,
can be answered on a bunch of different levels,
that's
but you
true.
and I for
That's true.
sure, I think we had a strong musical background, and I think that comes from, even in the womb experiences, what our parents were doing. And
Sure.
I think what music when it really moves you, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's, but people have guilty pleasure, right? Sometimes it's not always what you wish it was because maybe it's not as cool as what other people listen to. But it's like if it
Yeah.
strikes those strings inside you, man, holy crow, it's the
Well,
best
I mean,
feeling.
just on an example like that, I mean, there's a lot of commercial pop music. Like I remember when I was a kid having because my dad and I talked about music all the time and stuff. So because I remember him telling me, he was like, "Oh, I got to show my son some real rock and roll or something," because he thought all the pop music in the '80s was shit or something. So he's
Right.
like, I remember he put on Bill Haley in the comments. He's like, "This is the first rock and roll song or whatever." No, okay, but then he
Yeah.
put on Chuck Berry. And I was
Yeah.
blown away, man. I was like,
Yeah.
this is so fucking good, man. This, like, and
Yeah.
I've been a diehard Chuck Berry fan ever since that day that he put on,
Amazing.
what is it, Roll Over Beethoven or whatever, like you know. But one of the things, he understood music in the way you're describing. He studied it.
Yeah.
I'm sure he feels it too, but he had gone and learned classical music. He's, and all this kind of stuff and everything and become, really deep into that. I'm
Yeah.
not sure, but just I remember having a conversation with him. Just what I wanted to tell you. So, and I remember there was the Monkees.
Uh-huh.
Somehow the Monkees came up, and he was like, this is a long time ago. I'm sure he can appreciate the Monkees now, but
Yeah.
he's like, oh, they're just a television group. They're terrible. They're no good or what. And I remember like, well, what about Take the Last Train to Clarksville? It's a pretty good song.
Yeah.
And he's like,
It's
oh, like a
great.
boring, stupid, blah blah blah. But I listen to the Monkees. I love the Monkees. Like,
totally.
and they're like they're the original boy band that were literally made up, and they're
I
good.
mean,
I mean, they're actually
ignoring the
good,
fact that
you
those
know,
guys,
right?
yeah, ignoring the fact that those guys wanted to write their own songs when they got hired on that show. Maybe not all of them, but definitely, there's a couple of where like we were under the impression that we're going to be writing our own songs. But aside from that, something to appreciate about that whole boy band or the sort of the packaged thing. Again, I came to this kind of later in life, but
Me too.
um,
Me too.
it's
Yeah.
important to
Yeah.
it's really important to I think dissect what you're really good at. And the two main things I sort of think about when I talk about that is there's people who write music and there's people who perform music.
Right.
And
Right. They're not
um,
always the same people. Sometimes they
they're
are.
not always
But
the same
right.
people.
Yeah.
And I don't think, and maybe I got this from watching a Britney Spears concert. My girlfriend walked in on me, on Friday night by myself watching Britney Spears, like, on stage. And she was like, almost like caught me watching porn or something. Like, what the fuck are you doing? You know, and I think I was having a moment, where it was like, this woman is working her ass off
And she's
on this
very
stage.
good.
And she's
Not an
very good and she's
accident. Yeah.
commanding all these
Yeah.
people. I don't know how big that venue was, but it was a stadium full of people. And at that point, who cares who wrote the fucking song? I mean,
Yeah.
I do because I'm
Yeah.
a songwriter, so it's interesting. But it really hit home that and to bring it back to the Monkees, like those guys, and maybe they didn't even perform the song. Maybe it was pre-recorded. I don't remember, but it is a good point to remember that these are not always the same person delivering the same talent, and
Yeah.
it shouldn't diminish the enjoyment of the thing.
For sure, for sure. I mean, if you enjoy it and and it happens to be it's like I don't like Marvel movies, but if
Yeah,
somebody likes to go see a Marvel movie, like Marvel movies are well made. I mean,
yeah,
they're
yeah,
they're produced in a clear, coherent way. They've got, I don't know whether they're using Chat GPT to write the scripts yet. I mean, I'm sure Chat GPT can write a pretty good script too, right?
yeah.
So, but it still could be
Well, I
good,
don't know. I
right?
mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I definitely would argue that Tony Stark is Robert Downey Jr. I mean, that guy does an amazing job playing Iron Man.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but does it rank up there with some of his other best performances? I mean, maybe it does, but it's, again, uh, yeah, you don't necessarily judge the whole. You don't need to judge if you're enjoying an aspect of it, or you understand the artistry that goes into the thing.
Yes.
That
Well,
there's like,
I think what we're talking about here is the difference between art and maybe craft, right? Like what you began the discussion talking about is art, where you're really
yeah,
focusing on how to create something that's never existed before, at least in this plane of existence, and also to express yourself as an individual in some way, right?
yeah.
So if you look at the Marvel movies, they're not that. You look at Breaking Bad, that's Vince Gilligan
Well,
as an artist, like actually bringing something new to the world. And the
yeah.
Marvel movies are a bunch of team of committee of people, right? I'm totally winging it. I'm
Well,
not even
it's
sure if
easy
it's
to
true, but
say.
you know more about
It's
it. But
easy to say. I don't know. I don't. I we've talked politics before, and I don't want to get into it, but necessarily. But it's sometimes it's easy to forget that there are, because it's a big machine. The Marvel thing or Hollywood in general is this big machine that churns out. And in my head, when I say that, I think about Pink Floyd's The Wall. Like I think I see this big
yeah, the
animation
meat grinder,
the
like
meat grinder,
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
animations and the hammers walking and stuff. And I see this thing, it's easy to forget that there are people in there, and not just people, but
yeah,
people who, yeah, of course, they're getting paid big bucks to do this. Maybe they wouldn't otherwise, but also they're doing a pretty stellar job. Like for like Robert Downey Jr. specifically, really transcends the thing. In my mind,
yeah.
I watch him and I go, this guy is like he's like walking around with like what would be, like ancient deep sea diver equipment,
Yeah.
iron boots. He's basically loaded with this shit, bad writing, super slick production, trope after trope of boring cliche, and yet this guy still
He's
through
killing
all
it.
that.
Yeah.
through the filter, and not even live on stage, but like has to go through the camera. The image has to be processed, has to be edited, has to be, blah blah blah. And still, this guy's delivering a performance that cuts through all that stuff. To
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
that is
That's
something to
interesting.
talk about. I mean, you could definitely take it or leave it, Marvel movies. But I think the artistry, I think to just blanketly say that, it's not art
No, you're
is
right. You're right. It's
probably
what you're saying
selling it short.
too. Yeah, I just quickly wanted to say something about what you're saying is that they might be majority this kind of machine type thing, but there are people, individuals within it who are doing great art within that whole craft network of massive, production. You're describing
Yeah,
Robert Downey Jr. is one person who's shining through, let's say. Is
yeah,
that accurate to frame it like that? Is that, I don't know.
yeah. Well, and I think your point about what is an art and what is craft is a valid point too. I mean, I would definitely not want to be the expert to, where that line is between art and craft
Probably
because I,
not obvious. It's probably very hard to
well,
find where it is,
or,
right?
or it's very,
Yeah.
yeah, or it's very personal. Because someone's, because I don't want to get too specific here, but I can be really picky, and I am really picky about the things I like and what I consider art and what I don't consider art. I'm not sure I'm going to write a book about it, but
Maybe you
because it's
should.
very personal. I
Maybe you
mean, it's
should.
maybe one day, but it would offend a lot of people. I have a lot of friends who I consider, you know, creative people, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to diminish their, um, uh,
Self-esteem
I
or
wouldn't
yeah,
what they're doing,
yeah.
But there is a big difference, and maybe I'm misguided in saying Robert Downey Jr. is an artist, but there is a big difference,
He's a
and
great actor. I mean, Robert Downey Jr. is a like one of the best as far as I can tell
yeah,
in films. I use the Marvel movies as an example. I mean, it's just
it's a good
because
one.
yeah, like basically what I see. This is a side note onto the visual domain, but I kind of see like a split where Hollywood films have become these sort of machine craft producing things, and then all the
Yeah,
series television is where all the individual artists, the Vince Gilligans and all that, have migrated over to. Now that's a gross generalization. There's
yeah,
a lot of crap being pumped out on Netflix too. That's all formulaic, and then there's great. Robert Downey Jr. is amazing in Iron Man or whatever on the big screen, right? So
yeah.
I think that just that's sort of a general distinction
But
there.
let's bring it back to music,
Sure.
and let me
The
ask you
monkey.
this: what do you think
Yeah.
about Malcolm McLaren putting together a boy band in 1970s Britain?
Great point. I mean, this is yeah, that's a beautiful. Just to be clear, what we mean, the Sex Pistols were they were a creation from. Tell me if you. I think this is true. I believe it's true. Malcolm McLaren went to New York in the 70s and he saw a band in CBGB's, the New York Dolls, who I'm sure
Yeah,
listeners will know. I love the New York Dolls. I think they're
me
fantastic,
too.
for the same
Yeah.
reasons I'm sure you do. And he was like,
Mhm.
wow, this is so great. These guys are so fucking raw and they're so wild and everything. I want to bring them to London. So he went back to London and he was trying to bring them over. And then by the time they were going to come, they broke up. And so he
Right.
decided, well, I can make my own band. So he got, a bunch of these sort of, actually some good musicians. I mean, one of the guys in the Sex Pistols was quite well trained. Steve Jones,
Yeah.
is that his name?
Yeah.
Johnny Rotten had to learn how to. Well, no, Sid. Who's the one who had to learn how to play guitar in the Sex Pistols? I forget.
Well, Sid Vicious was bass, and he couldn't play bass.
Yeah. He couldn't do much except shoot smack, really. But he was cool. I mean, he had a sensibility about him, right? Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, just
And let's
to
not.
answer your question. I mean, the Sex Pistols revolutionized rock and roll, and I had Sonny Greenwich on the podcast, and
I mean, he brought, like you said, the dolls were very underground at that time. I mean, it's you can go
that's right.
Spotify that.
Yeah, they were in New
You can go
York,
stream
and
that
that's
shit
it.
right now if
Yeah,
you want. But
yeah.
back then, that shit's hard to find. There's this little scene happening, a really cool little scene, and yeah, I think it's like the Marvel movie comparison is there. He Malcolm McLaren brought that idea of what the dolls were to
the massive
a bigger
audience.
audience
Yeah.
by packaging it. And let's not forget about Vivian
Yeah.
Westwood, who's again a craft not a crafts lady. She's an artist, and the visual piece of the Sex Pistols was also huge,
That's right.
and
That's right.
so the whole thing was kind of put together, even though it was like, it wasn't
Yeah, I
completely
see your point. Yeah, your point is that this is a case where the craft and the art are intersecting in a certain way. There's a kind of there's a
yeah.
commercial creation, but it's very much done through an artistic sensibility. Is that kind of what I mean?
Yeah, and I think my
right?
point,
Yeah,
yeah, and my point as a pop guy, like, and I'll use pop music in its widest term, because that's how I like to. I really hate the over genreifying, music, but so, but I was, as a pop guy, what's the difference? Who
Mhm.
cares? Do I care
Yeah,
when I go throw on the Bollocks record that
yeah.
Malcolm McLaren kind of came with this idea? No, man, there's enough personality and anger and piss and shit, that in those records, that I'm so invested.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a
I don't
great
think
album. I mean, that they made that
yeah,
one album that was,
yeah,
that was, and then well, they fell apart or whatever. And that, with
yeah,
Sonny Greenwich, when he was on, he mentioned how that album was instrumental in his becoming a pop musician as well. I mean, he's born
yeah,
about 10 years before us, so when he was a teenager, that was a thing. He also
yeah,
pointed out how the riff, if you listen to, I forget which song he was referencing, he pointed out how the guitar riff had a kind of a poppy quality. I forget which song. I'd have to go back and re-listen to it, which that stuck with me when he said that, how,
uh-huh.
but, because even musically, they had a kind of, even though they were these raw, fuck the system, they were actually, they had 3-minute songs. You could sing them,
Yeah,
the stuff we talked about earlier, right? They had all
yeah,
that stuff, right?
yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
all right, so the Sex Pistols definitely are up there on your influences list. It sounds like, right?
They are, but they weren't. They like I said earlier, you and I kind of diverged a little bit. You kind of went more into that world,
It's
the
true.
punk world,
Yeah,
earlier, and it took me a while to get. It usually takes me a while to get back to like the source. I call it I call it like I get really into the derivatives, and then I find the
you
source.
work
It happened with the
backwards.
Velvet
Yeah,
Underground for me.
yeah.
So I came back to the Sex Pistols later, when I wasn't totally ready at the time. The Clash I was obsessed with, um, but I didn't go far beyond it, into punk specifically of the genre at the time. So it was like, but yeah, absolutely, they're up there.
We were into another thing I'm remembering now too. I don't know how much of this that I've rediscovered, that I found that I thought at the time was sort of tacky, but I've learned is actually really good, was Tears for Fears,
Oh
for
God, man, yeah.
example. I mean, they are
So that's
so
more the
good,
world.
you know.
Yeah, that's
And
more the
at the
world
time, I was
I
like, "Oh,
slipped
this is
into.
so tacky Brit pop or whatever." But
Yeah,
as I've gotten older, I'm like, these guys are like amazing. Even Duran Duran are very good,
yeah,
and they were
no, for
really
sure.
big, and they were in the air at that time. We were hearing them.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of unfortunateness in the production of the 80s. The things got a little lost, and I wonder how, Hungry Like the Wolf or whatever, Girls on Film,
Yeah,
like how would that be approached today if Rick Rubin, if Durant,
great question.
this young
Yeah,
bunch of young 20-year-olds went into Rick Rubin's studio and said, here's what we've been writing,
yeah.
and wonder how, because part of why I don't really listen to those records, and there is, it's great, Duran, a lot of that stuff is great pop. I can't.
You
I
can't
get
handle it.
hung up
Yeah.
on the production, just the way it sounds. Like some of it's
Is
good.
it
I
the
mean,
synth? Is it the synth sounds like I love Eurythmics and I love Tears for Fears. Like those two are
it's
like
not the same stuff,
emblematic
dude.
80s, right?
You remember that one record, that one Fix record? I was obsessed with that.
Oh yeah, the
When you
Fix.
were,
Yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
remember we listened to
when
that
you were going
endlessly.
more
Yeah.
into the punk thing, I was definitely on the new wave. I was more in the synthy, the Cars,
I love the
and
Cars
that,
now.
what was
Yeah.
that Fix record though? Reach the Beach.
Reach the Beach. Yeah, that was I think John Rallier, a friend of ours. He
Yeah,
turned me on to that album, and then I guess I listened to it with you because I actually still remember those songs. I still
yeah.
have them in my head, like because I
Saved by
listened to that album
Zero.
so much. And that's very good. I mean, that's a band that's completely like whatever happened to them. They kind of
I know.
they're
One or
just
two
gone,
records and then gone.
just
Yeah.
gone. And they weren't as big as Tears for Fears or Eurythmics or something, right? But they were
Yeah.
kind of one of those side bands. Yeah,
Right.
so that stuff influenced you as well. Just on this point you mentioned about working backwards, when I was in the punk thing when we were kids or whatever, and then we diverged, and then I got really into like a lot of like hippie '60s stuff, and I started listening to the Grateful Dead, and like I went to see the Grateful Dead a few times and all this kind of
Oh
stuff. I don't
wow.
know if you knew that, yeah, and all this. I was big into that. And then later on, when I moved to Montreal, I started working backwards into the punk stuff. And then I wanted to ask you about this. So I got as I got into my later teen years, and then when I came to Montreal, I was huge into Iggy Pop, and
Yeah.
I'm like a massive. I love Iggy Pop. I think he's just
Yeah.
he's everything you were describing about the kind of the artist. I feel like he's like if he's writing a song, he's like you were describing, trying to find the thing in the
Yeah.
like I can
Yeah.
sort of imagine him, sort of trying to like just writing it down and kind of come up with the melody and stuff. So
I
um
never get the sense that Iggy Pop could put out anything that isn't authentic,
yeah.
and that might mean like David Bowie, that might mean a bad record every now and then, but it doesn't mean like it means that guy is invested in what he's doing, and that to me that is the artist. That's the probably the differentiator between whatever the commercial thing that we're talking about that you want to be careful of, and
I think
uh,
what you were saying
and being a
about
true artist.
Bowie, like Bowie is, I mean, this is not to insult Bowie, but you saying how you couldn't connect with him. He's the more commercial artist who's
Yeah,
doing it for I mean, I don't mean any disrespect to David Bowie, but he's the Marvel movie and Iggy Pop is the Martin Scorsese or something like that, right?
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know if that's a very crass way of framing it, but I mean, even when they worked together, who was bigger, right? I mean, Iggy Pop writes China Girl, right? And sings it on one of his albums, and no one ever hears it.
yeah,
And then, a year or two later, Bowie puts it out, and it's like a huge hit all over the world. And I,
yeah,
I don't know how to think about that because I love David Bowie too, but I agree with you that David Bowie never touches me deeper in my bones the way Iggy Pop does. Even though I'm sure
yeah,
Iggy Pop is David Bowie is a better musician. He can probably play more instruments and all this kind of stuff, and his voice is probably better. He's got this deeper, more powerful operatic voice and everything, and he can do all that, but I don't know. There's something about Iggy Pop that I can't quite put my finger on. I'm not
yeah.
sure, how to think about that. By the way, just before you might want to respond to that, I should say I went to New York once in about 1992 or 93 or something, and and I was there, and they were making the Basketball Diaries, and I saw Mark
Oh
Wahlberg,
yeah.
yeah, and all this, and so anyway, and so I went into a record store on St. Mark's Place, and I found Iggy Pop, American Caesar. I don't know if you know that album,
Hmm.
and I was like, "Wow,
I
this is
don't really
great."
know it.
Yeah, it's a great album. So I bought it, and I came back, and I was all depressed, in my little apartment in Montreal, and I was listening to Iggy Pop, and I was like, "This is so amazing," and I was listening to the lyrics, and I was all into it. So I thought I'd write him a letter. So I wrote him a letter, forgot about it. And then, about a year or two later, my aunt was living in the apartment, Neeson's mom. And they're like, a letter came from New York, and Iggy Pop had handwritten me a letter.
Wow,
I know,
dude.
I know. And it was handwritten. And he had obviously read what I'd written him this long fan mail, like, oh, what do you mean about
Wow.
this lyric or whatever? It seems like it means this, like it was all, whatever. I don't even remember. And so I remember, one thing I remember about that letter was
Tell me you have that letter though, dude.
no, my folly of youth. I used to stay up late and do a lot of substances with a friend of mine, of some friends, and
Yeah.
this one guy I knew who's a little bit less reputable. He was a big Iggy Pop fan, so I used to show him, and we'd be up doing coke or whatever. And I think he stole it, so it's gone.
Uh-huh.
But I am trying to use it. I just want to mention this for listeners. I want
Yeah.
to. I'm trying to find a way to reach out to Iggy Pop's people to explain this story to try and get him on the Mega Blast podcast, because I could imagine
Oh,
him
cool.
wanting, yeah, I could imagine him wanting to do a podcast like this. He's like, the fact that he wrote me a letter in 1993 tells
Yeah,
me that he might want to. So yeah, unfortunately
totally,
gone. But
totally.
are you a fan of his? You like
I
your
am.
yeah.
Again, I came to it later. There's one of the last kind of bands before I came down here that I played in was called the Legendary Dirt Bikers, and
I wanted to
um,
mention them earlier. Yeah, great name.
yeah,
Yeah.
so the cool. I mean, I played with those guys in a previous band as well, but the cool thing about that band, it was mostly a trio. Eventually, we got a solid drummer, but one of my favorite things about that band was that we all kind of came from a very different. I mean, could be described as a garage band kind of band. So obviously, there was a meeting place, the contextual meeting place. But um, the best thing about that was the guitarist Fred, who was my co-writer for a long time, was a huge Stooges fan. MC5. I mean, he grew up next to Detroit, as he would say,
Okay.
Detroit.
Nice.
You know,
Yeah.
and um, and so he came with a very strong garage rock, Motor City kind of vibe, and the other guitarist was more Townes Van Sant kind of songwritery,
Oh,
and
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and then I'm
Interesting
sort of the pop
mixture.
guy,
That,
coming
that's a
from,
really interesting mixture of styles to put together as
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So, but all that to say, that's kind of when I really started taking it seriously, meeting Fred, and sharing CDs and stuff. That's when I really got into Iggy and
Right.
Stooges and that whole like I said, that whole thing, kind of
Okay.
garage rock thing. Yeah. So like I kind of came to some stuff later. Definitely maybe one of my favorite things about being a musician is meeting musicians and with really strong tastes in music and not always things, especially things that I've not heard of or not really connected to before. And then making those connections through music is especially playing in a room, in a jam room, and all that stuff kind of coming out. It just
Yeah.
comes out of the port, and just mixes in the room.
Well,
It's
there's
really
an
exciting.
experience that musicians. I mean, Keith Richards wrote about this in his book about how he said, sometimes you go into a studio and you sort of record the guitar part, and he said, it's just not the same. He said there's something about when you get all the guys together and you just play together, like something happens, like there's
It's
some
everything.
sort of like this other plane that you were talking about,
Yeah, but you
something
know
about
what?
how you
It,
mix to get like you kind of get together. I used to have that sense. You get into a zone, right? Is that one way
yeah,
to think about it? I don't know.
yeah. It is. I mean, I was going to say it's one thing to do it by yourself. That is magic. It feels like Harry Potter and you suddenly open this portal, and you're kind of like, oh, like
Yeah.
holy fuck, this is like I'm
What
connected
the
to
hell is in
the
here? Like, how did I find this?
yeah, or Jim Carroll kind of vocab, it's like it's the main vein, you're kind of
Main
like you
vein,
suddenly
yeah. You hit the vein.
you've opened the vein, and it's like it's probably one of the it probably feels a lot like heroin. One of the things I haven't tried, but it probably feels a lot like that. You open up this portal and you are completely somewhere else, and yet it doesn't even touch the bliss of doing it with other people.
Yeah.
It's kind of like sex, I guess. It's the difference between like the first time you come by yourself, and then
Yeah.
the next, and then
When you
when
come
someone else
with, yeah,
makes you
when you have
come,
sex. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
it's
that's a great comparison. Like comparing it to an individual sexual experience can be
yeah,
amazing. But if you're with somebody else and you have that, if you both really connect sexually,
yeah,
that's the same as
yeah.
connecting musically or intellectually. A great conversation too, right? You kind of
It's very, and
yeah,
actually they are very close. I think the sexual experience is very close to the musical experience, but they are also very different. And
of
it's one of
course.
the kind of things you can experience with someone on a platonic level that you just, I mean, maybe there's other ways. I've never been an athlete. I've never played on a team. Maybe it's similar to that, or if you ask a business dude, what it's like to be in the pen with the stock exchange and big traders and stuff. I mean, maybe there's similar comparisons, but all I can tell you is there really is, like, in my experience, nothing compares to like being in a room with some people, male or female, and having a spiritual connection through music. Maybe meditation is close, but I don't think it even touches actually making music with people, because you're manifesting on the spot in real time, connected. I don't know on what level, on probably multiple levels. Um, I've never been a big fan of the Grateful Dead, but definitely like speaking in jam band kind of terms, especially when you're not rehearsing a song that you already know, but completely coming up with something out of the ether with other people, is kind of one of the best things I've ever experienced. The
Yeah.
most magical things. And it's talk about chasing the dragon. That
Yeah.
experience. It's hard
Yeah.
once you've tasted it, man. It's hard to let it go. So I've never been, to
Yeah.
this, but I've never been interested in being a solo artist. It's always for me about connecting with people, like-minded or not. Completely opposites. Like I said, the
From those
Stooges.
two. Yeah. The
Yeah, couldn't
Stooges
have
and the
been
Townsends.
any
Yeah.
further away from what I was. I mean, not really, but in some ways, there's definitely, like, obviously we're streams that were connected, but it's really amazing to make those connections and make new art, birth new art with people that in that way.
Yeah, well, it's also, I mean, you're describing the experience that musicians have when they play together. We both were talking about that, and you're talking about it. But there's
Yeah,
also when a band is playing, I mean, the Grateful Dead did this, when they're doing that in the presence of an audience, there's
right.
something
Sure.
like why, I experienced this during the pandemic, like we had to do, I'm a teacher, I'm in college, so
Yeah.
so we had to do it all on Zoom. So I figured out how to do it on Zoom, but I hated it. I mean, I just hated doing it on Zoom. It was, and after I've been doing it for a while, and then I went back, I realized what it's like. It's sort of like if you could tell someone you could go see Drake, we got
Yeah.
tickets to Drake, or there's a live stream, and you can have a super 5.1 system in your home, and you're at home, so you can smoke or you can drink, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't have to wait in line at the Bell Center, it's cold or whatever, and then you go in and it's sweaty and everyone's moving around, bumping on you. I think most
Yeah.
people would still go to the Bell Center because there's something about being in there and he's there. Like you're in the same physical place as him, right? And
It
there's
does make
something
all the
that can
difference.
happen, right? What's
But
that?
some people never experience that, dude. And
Yeah.
and it's like travel. Some people never really leave home, and that's fine. Maybe that you don't want to, but until you actually have that experience of being in a
Right.
sweaty club. Because I remember being at you remember Art Bergman? I remember
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
like, he was like a local, kind of scrappy musician in the Toronto scene, and I was a big fan of a couple of his records. And I remember going out, being, I was, if there was general admission, I was at the front of the stage, and I wanted to see the set
Nice.
list. I wanted
Yeah.
to see the stock boxes the guitarists were using, and that fucking guy, he sweat so bad. Um, he
That's
he
great.
was like, you might as well have had a hose, like spraying the first few rows of like people,
Wow.
because like what was dripping off his body. And I think some people probably wouldn't be into that. And I
Yeah.
remember thinking, like,
Yeah.
I'm not so into it, because it's like I can smell it. It's really visceral. I can feel it. But there's something undeniably fucking great about it too.
Yeah.
And um,
Well, it's hard.
or
It's hard to quantify because I mean, if it's a club, you
yeah,
can sort of understand because it's small.
you
But
can't you
even
can't.
even if it even if it's a big, I went to see the Rolling Stones in Quebec City on the Plains of Abraham some years ago,
Yeah,
and it's a huge. You're out there on the plains, right? And
yeah,
and still it was amazing. Even just the
yeah,
just and they're old and everything, but just the fact of being there with them, I don't
yeah.
know how to explain what that is. I'm not, and the other thing is, you don't know, is it a placebo thing? Like, is it all in my mind? Our minds are pretty
No,
powerful, right?
no.
So,
It's this one goes back to the Robert Downey conversation and the filter of being weighed down by the filters of a big machine. And not to say that the Stones are that, but I think, and I haven't played in giant stadiums, or arenas, but I feel like that upscaling of what you're doing in a dirty club, takes a lot of experience. It takes, how do we, and to get through the filter of being in the nosebleeds, how do you talk to the people in the nosebleeds when you're, Angus Young? you or or Keith Richards or whatever we're talking about, that is something that makes or breaks a band. And you at that level, you are the Stones because
You can do
not
both,
only
right? You
yeah,
can,
not only
yeah,
do you can you go through that filter of talking to the people in the nosebleeds, personally, when you're belting out these songs you've belted out for 40 years, for all intents and purposes should be fucking totally sick to death of, you know, but you can
yeah.
do that. If you can do that on that scale, that is an experience thing. That is something that you're not born with. You
Develop.
hone over
Yeah.
yeah, you develop that shit. You develop, as much as you're developing your sound, the songwriting changes at that scale. You become a little more anthemic. You are reaching deep into the heart of people way at the back of the room on the plains,
It's
on a
interesting.
giant field, and
Yeah.
that is something that takes a lot of years of work.
Does that interest you at all? Like, I mean, imagine if you were to get more popular, as we move towards closing, I want you to talk about your current music work.
Yeah,
But imagine if let's say you got back together with those two guys and you guys got really big and you had a chance to play. I imagine it might be an interesting challenge, at least, right? To at least, I don't know, or is it just too big and too commercial, or I don't know how you think about that.
uh, all I can say is I would love the opportunity to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
I'd be in. I'd
yeah.
be all in.
It must be
And
really
even
hard. I
if
mean,
it all exploded,
it must be really hard on a technical level, as you were alluding to earlier, right? How do you
yeah,
get the
yeah.
sound to be the same when you're in an enormous space like that, where, right? It's very hard.
It's definitely easier now. I mean, right? I mean, imagine, back then if you went to see the Stooges in their heyday, or the great example, of course, is because it's well documented, is how bad those Beatles concerts sounded because
Yeah,
they just didn't
that's
have a
right.
PA system,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
people are screaming like you've got like
All the
40,
girls.
50,000 people at Shea
Yeah,
Stadium screaming, and you have this like completely inadequate, PA
yeah,
system. But nowadays, dude, I mean, I just read an article about, people were like shocked, like, oh my, the Edge isn't playing through amps at this like, Las Vegas Sphere. They had this residency in Las Vegas, Acton Baby reunion thing,
oh,
and
okay.
like they're shocked that he's not playing through amps, and because you can get pedals that emulate the sound of that your favorite Marshall stack, right, or whatever,
Really,
and
really.
and
Wow.
yeah, and
That's
that's the truth. It's all we're living kind of in the future now, and you don't actually need to have an amplifier on stage with you to project that sound because
ah,
you're going through so many, again, all those filters, that huge sound system reaching this giant place, the people in the back. And yeah, there's going to be places in that field or in that stadium that sound better than others, but overall, the technology is just so great these days. You don't have to really, you're not as worried about those things.
yeah.
Um,
The
and of course,
technology
at
has
that level,
advanced.
hopefully
Yeah.
you've got a team.
Yeah,
Yeah.
speaking of, Rick Rubin has a really good podcast. I don't know if you've heard.
Mm,
It's very, very
I
good.
love it.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
he does. It's
He,
all audio, and he talks to all these big guys. And he did one with Iggy Pop, and they were talking exactly about.
yeah.
Iggy said that in the early days when he was going to shows in Detroit, I guess this is the '60s or whatever, he said he would walk around the room to try and find the best place. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because he said in some
Totally.
places you like couldn't hear the bass at all. You hear the drums would be blasting or whatever. You move somewhere else, you couldn't hear the drums. It'd just be the bass, and then over here the guitar, and you try and find the right place where they were just mixed correctly. And
Yeah.
that's what mixing is. Sound mixing is how to get it.
Yeah.
It's not right. These individual elements, right? They have to be integrated together or something, right? So yeah.
Oh, I mean that goes a long way to really illustrate that Iggy cares a lot, about the sound, and at his level in those kind of venues. On an indie level, I can tell you that that's kind of automatically what you do. If you're at the level that you have your own sound guy, and I've done a couple of things like that, tours where you bring your own sound guy along, um, you can kind of start trusting that they're doing, they've got your best. They know your sound. They know, when the solo comes on, the guitar,
Right.
the lead
Right.
guitarist gets a little boost, but the level just below that, that indie level just below that, where you showed up in some bumfuck, Minneapolis, some little sports bar, and you're supposed to play to this guy who'd rather be home watching Married with Children or whatever. Like, you know, you have to
Right.
walk around the room. You have to check what he's doing and let him know. Let these and this is why a lot of people, you always thank your sound guy. I mean, not always. I've pissed off
If
a
they
few of
do a
them,
good
but it
job.
definitely,
Yeah.
yeah. These guys have no vested interest in you other than coming back next Friday to keep their job as sound guy. Like, who are you? And they don't know when, especially if you've got, if you're a kind of band that has different, I've been in a band like that where you got three guitar players and they all take solos. Are you actually sitting there listening to the band, this indie band that blew in from who knows where, and like, are you riding those faders to make sure that that little solo gets heard, or those riffs, and the harmonies and blah blah, and it's all EQ'd properly, and all that stuff. You have to walk around the room. But to hear that Iggy Pop, yeah, I listened to that same
Yeah.
podcast. To hear that he does it at his level, it really it goes a long way to illustrating.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
There's a lot of
there's a lot of sort of mundane things, but they're very important in music. In the sense of live music, and it's very, and just the room itself, the room you're in. My
yeah,
dad talks about this endlessly about good rooms and bad rooms, and he's
yeah.
very attuned
Well,
to
he was an
that.
acoustic player, though, right? I mean,
Yes,
he was in
yeah,
orchestra, right? He was
yeah,
the
he's French
French
horn,
horn.
yeah,
Yeah. So I mean, that guy needs a good room, right?
yeah.
You don't have. I mean, there may be some room mics around, to help depending on the venue, but mostly you're filling the room with the shit you're actually blowing with your lips, right?
Yeah. One
It's
final
huge.
thing I'll say about that Iggy Pop thing was that he talked about how, the way mixing has gotten better and better, but they also said that there's an argument to be made that if you go way back to when there was not even multi-tracking, they talked about Frank Sinatra, that the sound guys would literally they'd listen to the band and then they'd say, okay, Frank, move over here. Like stand a bit over
Right.
here, and the mixing,
Yeah.
the way they described it was that the mixing was being done in the room, not by the guys on the boards, but just in the room floating together. So you got
Yeah.
to move them, literally physically move them a little bit. And, I found that really hard it's hard for me to understand that, but it makes a certain kind of sense if you have
It's
right?
totally logical, dude. And I don't know enough about it, but sound coming out of any source, guitar, your vocal cords, an amp, it goes in a direction depending on its frequencies, and it hits surfaces like walls and people, and it reacts differently. It bounces around,
Right, right.
and it's not just an art. I mean, it's not just a science. It's an art. You people who build recording studios, who build venues,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
for sure back in the day, yeah, man. I mean, I've been in clubs as a bass player, especially because I'm hitting frequencies that aren't always super pleasant. I've rattled like the lighting rig above me, like the whole, like
wow.
those big
Oh
bars
man.
hitting a certain note, and it's not like I'm super loud, I'm playing through a whatever 2 or 410 cabinet, and it's like, but
Wow.
it's like those frequencies that break glass, it's people just hit us. It doesn't have to be a volume thing, but a certain frequency can change a lot, and that goes a lot
That's
back to what we're saying
amazing.
about the visceral
That's
experience.
amazing.
That
Yeah, because the bass, I mean, it's a low end thing. So the lower the note, the lower the frequency. So you get more physicality. We're just back to the physicality. Like low notes
Yeah,
will sort of shake your insides in a certain way
yeah.
that high notes
I mean,
won't,
they build
right?
weapons like that, right? Hey, they build. I mean, they're sonic weapons.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And depending
Okay.
what conspiracy websites you're on, like people get killed for hitting certain.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, as we move towards closing, why don't you talk a little bit about you said you're doing a solo project, and I don't know if you're getting back together with these guys. I know you did a show there in your town in
Yeah,
Metro. I saw on Facebook. Was that last year? I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about what you're going into the future musically, let's say, something like that.
yeah. Well, I can tell you, coming, like the whole thing about moving here to. I live in Baja, California, um, in this little town. That I maybe I'm moving into the reclusive artist phase of my life. Like
Yeah.
it, as you know, it's not always. totally to being busy, like reaching me, so I just shut off. I bury myself sometimes. A lot of like coming down here was getting back to the source, getting back to the art of the thing. And even though my whole life I've been living as an artist, a freelance artist, being in film, having a production company, there's like a lot of distraction that takes you away from the actual making of the art. And I missed painting and I missed songwriting. I missed really getting into music. So the long story short is that I came down here to kind of get back to that, where the
Okay.
overhead is
Yeah.
lower, the inspiration is higher, and I can really focus on those things, And um, I have to say that the downside of that was it's a small town, it's a small scene, and although it's super actually robust and varied, it's a really artistic town. So there's lots going on here. It's still like when you get down to the kind of music I want to make, finding the kind of players that
Right.
I want to play
Right.
with that get my, even considering the dirt bikers and the different contexts that you can bring all these diverse. I could bring jazz guys or classical people, flamenco players into my fold, and I have. Super interesting, playing indie music with a flamenco guitarist.
Wow.
But like,
Cool.
but
Yeah.
yeah, and we'll talk about that if you want. But basically, um, the the overriding, you know, the thing was I knew I was coming down here to be more of a solo person.
Right. Right.
And
I see.
I've played with a band, I've pulled a band together, a trio that's amazing. We play mostly older songs, kind of my greatest hits, if you will, around town because it's kind of fun. It's nice to get in front of people and, on a semi-regular basis and throw stuff against the wall that people, clap at and whatever. People dig. Audiences are great down here, by the way. They're really
Right.
responsive, coming from
Yeah.
a cool place like Toronto. But no
Yeah.
dig at no dig at
Mexicans are a
Toronto.
little more enthusiastic than Canadians.
Well,
One way to think about it.
but it's a pretty big international scene, and it's as you know, as a world traveler, I know you're a big world traveler,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you take people out of their home, even the chilliest, most conservative places, and put them somewhere else, and they become new people. And this is
That's
one of those
true.
places.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
but
hilarious.
to answer your question, I came down here in the knowledge that I had to leave a really great reminds me of the Harry Belafonte song. I was like, had to leave a little girl in Jamaica town, but I had to leave a really cool project in Toronto. It was just forming as I kind of left to move to the West Coast and down here eventually. Um,
A
that I was kind
musical
of having to
project. You're
go
talking about a musical project, you mean,
a
in
musical
Toronto.
project. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It
Yeah.
was kind
Okay.
of just
Yeah.
forming. And we actually recorded. I mean, kind of a demo, but I think it's going to be released at some point.
I think I
But yeah,
remember
the
didn't
downside
you
was,
cut, sorry to interrupt, but didn't you cut a vinyl?
yeah,
Right? Yeah, I remember this.
with the dirt bikers, we cut vinyl. Yeah, we did it. Always my dream to do it like a 7-inch single, like a 45. So we did
Wow,
that.
nice. Okay. So
But that
you
was a
were
few years.
getting together with these guys and you had this thing coming out and then you decided to split town or something like that.
No, it was more like I was splitting town, and I kept on saying, "Hey guys, I'm like, we should get our shit together because I'm going to be leaving in like 6 months or whatever." And then it came down to the last few months, and they're like, "Hey, we should like get into a studio and record." This is a band called the Coattails that I one of my favorite people in the world, Kirk Hudson. He's a killer drummer. He's been my drummer through a few projects,
Okay,
going back to
nice.
just post college rock band
Wow,
days. But
long time.
yeah, yeah, and then a couple of new people that he introduced me to that are just like the most beautiful people in the world. Um, Paul and Leah and Clay. We basically we were jamming kind of loosely for maybe a year, 18 months, and then we all kind of knew the day was coming. I had to kind of remind them, and they were like, "Well, shit, we should hit the studio and actually solidify these songs, this batch of songs." And so it was a little bit like a kind of a going away present. Literally on the day I left,
Wow.
we did a second day or a third day of overdubs, and that project will definitely, it was never, we never played live, we never did a record release because the thing never really came out. But this, so that's what I'm saying is the sad part about coming down here. The good part is I came down here to focus on the art and get back, make it a big part of my life again.
Right.
And especially music, which was getting sidelined. um, that I had to leave people behind that I was just starting to gel with and be a solo artist, which, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not. I'm not interested in. I'm not Gordon Lightfoot. I'm not going to stand up there, or Neil Young. I wish. Stand
Yeah.
up there and be Mark Gabriel with an acoustic guitar and regale you with
That's
my
not
beautiful
you.
song.
You,
It's
you you
not
need
me.
you need a crew, right? You need a bunch of
On
guys,
a
a few
lot of levels,
people,
it's
right?
not me. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a bit of a fear piece in there. Like being
It's
basically
hard.
stripped. Yeah,
Standing up
you know,
alone with a guitar, man. I mean,
yeah.
Jesus Christ,
As a
that's
bass
not easy.
player, being stuck with an acoustic guitar. I mean, what the
Yeah.
fuck is that, right? So it's like
Yeah.
no. So on a lot of levels, but but since and since I've been down here, I realized that's one of the things I wanted to face was getting up on stage by myself, make sure that at least I did it, and it turned out to be pretty good. I play sort of fairly frequently, just songwriter
Okay.
night
Nice.
kind of yeah, really intimate kind of cool things
And
and
you sing.
stripping down
You
these
sing, right?
and I think, I mean, yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that we didn't get into much of that, but that's been a huge kind of path for me finding the voice. And definitely but being down here and focusing on the solo thing and the songwriting thing, taking that do it yourself kind of philosophy and being a little more educated about it, taking the songwriting to a new level, learning,
Wow.
more about the modes and so a little more theory and that kind of stuff. It's been a bit of a curve for me, which has been great. Um, but it's
So can I just
there,
quickly, I just want to understand so listeners understand. So what you're talking about is
yeah,
as you've been down there, you've put the bass down a little bit and you picked up a guitar and you started writing
yeah,
more songs and singing and even playing publicly in Todos Santos, right?
yeah, yeah. So the brief history is that as a bass player in a band, in multiple bands, a chain of bands. I always wrote, or mostly wrote, on acoustic guitar at home, and then I would
Right,
bring a
right,
song in
right,
to the band, and hand it over to much better guitar players,
right,
and pick
right.
up the
Yeah,
bass, which is where I'm
yeah.
comfortable. I would still end up singing. So as the last few projects,
You sang lead
over
when you were with them?
yeah,
Yeah, you were
yeah.
okay, lead vocalist. Okay, right.
So except for the last third 3 or 4 decades, 3 decades anyway, I've been kind of focused. I've been singing, writing, singing songs, but I would play bass, as in the band, and surround myself with people who could play guitar great, and focus on that. So,
Right.
except for the last project, like I said, the Coattails was the first time I kind of stuck to guitar, and which was a new experience, which is cool, which is really cool, super uncomfortable, but being very exposing because all the time I'm writing these songs in my bedroom and then suddenly I'm kind of playing them,
Right.
out in
Yeah.
public. Even in a band situation, it freaked me out. But down here, it did freak me out. It's become a bit of a natural. I've definitely warmed up to the thing,
Yeah.
but still, I like band situation. Um, and that band is still happening. I have definitely a live band down here. We haven't written much together, but all that to say, like, yeah, the other focus was trying to get better at songwriting, and then revisiting, 100 songs, like 75 songs, like a bunch of shit that I've been carrying around with me, that either the bands didn't pick up at the time. As a band, you kind of want them to get excited about the material
Of
you're bringing
course.
in.
I mean, they
So
got to
when
feel
somebody
it,
does it,
right? I mean, they got
yeah,
to be
it,
enthusiastic or
and they
else.
have to make it their
Yeah.
own.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's been a bunch of material that kind of just sort of became, I call them gutter balls, and bowling talk.
Yeah.
They kind of, I
Yeah.
collect them, and at some point I was like, well, I got to do something with this stuff. I still love, they're all my babies, right? There, some of them are better than others, but
So it's
I
more
knew
your
that,
stuff. Like the difference between what you're doing now and what you were doing when you were in Toronto is you've done most of the creation yourself, and you're also going to be playing the guitar when, like, I mean, you do that right?
Yeah.
And you're singing rather
Yeah.
than just sitting in your, in your bedroom or whatever, writing the song on the guitar and then handing over the song to the better guitarist and then stepping back on
Yeah.
the bass. You're more front and center now. Is that one way to
Yep. Yeah.
conceptualize it? Right.
And interestingly, on the as far as recording goes, you can kind of do all the things. You can play guitar and bass at the same time and sing at the same time. Who knew, right? You just
Yeah.
open up a new track and you can kind of lay it down. And so it's kind of nice to have that control. There's a few songs that I did play live that we just never got to record, that were, that with other bands, that were in part of the repertoire of other bands, that never really just got, and they never got fully documented in a recording studio. So those will be, they're revisited. They're
Okay.
maybe changed a little bit as I'm now playing the guitar parts, the solos,
Wow.
and
Okay.
except for the drums. I'm not a drummer, so I'm a good percussionist, but besides the percussing, I can't really do the stick drumming. So I may bring in people for that, or drum machine. I'm not sure. This depends on the song. But yeah, the cool thing is that I can focus on that thing, and still put new material out.
It sounds really cool. I mean, it sounds like you've gone on a kind of a discovery, a voyage of discovery a little bit. Have you gone down there? You went down there to focus more as an individual artist, like the visual art, the painting, but at the same time, you went on this voyage of discovery you've been on, right? Where
Yeah.
musically, where you're like, okay, now I have to find me musically rather than just sort of like me in a group. I'm going to do this me only. That's how it appears to me anyway, just from.
Well, and to be honest with you, dude, it was even scarier for me. It was scarier than that. I mean, I'm being a little cavalier about it, but the
What's
crossroads I
what's
was at.
scary? What's scary? Is it just the fact that you're more exposed because you're the one writing the
No, no,
music?
no. It's, music. It's always been received well, my music, but not maybe, not like to the level I wanted it to. Like, like you asked me about playing stadiums. I would have jumped at that chance if someone put me on tour as a younger version
You
of
and
me.
so many other great musicians. I mean,
Right?
Sonny Greenwich and Chris Berry of the
Yeah.
222s. I mean, these guys that are like fantastically good and they work for decades.
Yeah.
And they got up to that level where they're right, kind of, right. It sounds like you were at that. It's because it's really hard to get to where the Stones are. I mean, it's just fucking,
Well,
but it's luck
and
too,
it's
right?
not all it's built up to be either, right? I mean, like a lot of people don't actually enjoy that level of success.
Yeah.
They can't handle
Right.
it, or when they're with the
Kurt
wrong group of
Cobain
people.
type. Yeah. The
Yeah.
fame
Whereas
level.
artists, it's just like, this is not what I signed up for. I wanted
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
we as artists,
I
we
just
want to
love doing the
communicate.
music. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it comes with a lot of other stuff, right? It's loaded, super loaded. But I yeah, so I was kind of like, at some point as an artist, and a lot of people go through this, it's like I've opened those channels, the songs are coming, I'm putting my heart into this. At one point, do you go, all right, now it's time to go get a job, or go to
Right.
school. Like,
Right.
we
Yeah.
gotta,
Yeah.
like, gotta grow up. We can't be Peter Pan for, forever. We gotta go,
Got to pay the
move
bills.
on with
Right.
it. Especially if
Yeah.
you're not, yeah, you're not
Yeah.
selling records. No one's signing you to some label. So at some point you go like, well, okay, that's, time to wrap it up. But the problem is, as an artist, the channel. I mean, you can close it. You can try and close that channel. But if you keep getting inspiration to write songs and it just keeps coming, it can
Right.
be this.
Right.
It can be a load. So I was at this point where I didn't know. I come from film. I've been in film for 20 years and enjoying my life immensely on that side. But I still was painting a little bit. I was obviously still playing music and writing songs, but they were super sidelined, like as far as, film is 24/7, and you're traveling the world, whatever. There's not a lot of time to put into other things. But when it came time to kind of like reevaluate what I was doing and like, do I actually want to ever finish these records these songs I'm writing, or do these paintings I'm that are building up in my head, do I, you know, um, what is the thing I should be spending my time on? So my problem was actually a crossroads of three. Writing actually is another thing, but these three disciplines, very diverse, disparate disciplines, that they're connected. They, like I said, creatively they come from the same source, but which one? because they're all full-time jobs, and they all
Right,
take a
right, yeah,
lifetime. We were saying with the Stones, it's a lifetime to get to the level they're at. So what do you put your energy into, and
yeah.
should you put it into anything? So for me, I was at this crossroads, and I think what I really needed was an external force to kind of come along and pull me out of, give me like some kind of like illuminate a path,
Okay.
basically.
And
At
did
that
it?
point, I was sort of like,
Did that
huh?
happen? Did that did
It did happen, and it's the
yeah.
reason I'm sitting here in my own gallery
Right.
making paintings and stuff. Because I painted a few things. I mean, I wrote a few songs, I played a few shows, and people showed up. I mean, even some full rooms.
Wow.
But
Nice.
it wasn't like paying the bills. It wasn't like, I don't know. For some reason, the painting was like, okay, this I can do this. People were
Yeah.
buying these paintings. Um, I
So you
needed a
were
little bit of,
drawn back towards that for partly for personal reasons, partly for commercial reasons. You were drawn back over to the
yeah.
painting. You may better able to make a living doing that, right? Is that
Well,
yeah,
this is always the trick, right?
yeah,
And I'm a bit of a sucker for a good life.
yeah, yeah. Aren't we all?
Back in the day, we didn't call it foodies.
Yeah.
My dad was a gourmet, right? Austrian.
Oh man,
Uh,
yeah. But
we ate really well. And I was like, I like traveling. So there's a bit
yeah.
of, I don't know. You can do it. You can do it on no budget. I've met some really cool people who travel the world, with
Living
the clothes on
poor,
their
it
back.
kind of sucks. Like being poor, like being
I
handsome.
mean, I
It's
admit to being a bit of a privileged kind of person on that side.
yeah,
I like a bit of a comfort thing, but also as an artist who expresses themselves, I needed to. That still has to be the thing. I
yeah,
can't. I'm not
yeah,
going to get a job. I'm not going to just get a job on Wall Street or whatever. So
yeah.
yeah, no, it
I,
had to
I'm
be. It had to make sense.
I'm glad you
And
mentioned
so the music is it's a little slow, and the plan, it's working out pretty great, but it's definitely the art has taken the front seat, and the music is a little bit still in the back seat, which is frustrating. But
okay.
I think without a little bit of frustration, and like I said earlier, nothing's worth doing unless there's limitations, unless
Well,
there's kind of
yeah.
like,
I mean, we can't avoid negative emotions like being frustrated. I mean, they're a part of life
yeah,
too. So you got to kind of
it's
live.
all good.
Yeah, so that's really cool. Okay, it's a good place to end. I also because
Yeah, man.
you've opened up a lot of cool stuff for the next one, the stuff about the the gallery and the visual art and all that stuff. There's still a few things I want to get back to on the next one about our personal life, but I'm really glad you mentioned your father because he's passed away since we've seen each other, and
Yeah.
he was just such a great man, and he really helped form me in a lot of ways. He was
Wow.
very influential on my brother. My parents were splitting up, and your father was really he was a great man. Your father, he was an Austrian immigrant, and he started his own business and had a family, and he was very erudite, and he had this Austrian accent, when he spoke English, spoke beautiful English, and and he could sort of. I remember him telling he would talk about holding court, like he was all proud how he could like tell these
Yeah.
stories in front of a room and stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Just to close a little bit, do you feel you get any of that performance from him in any way? I don't
I
know.
mean, dude, completely. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know. I don't know about you, how you're feeling, but like, I would walking through my day, and suddenly I'm like, oh my God, I'm my father.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I say that with a huge grin and a
Reverence,
point of
right?
pride. But
Yeah.
I couldn't have had a better dad. Like he was huge for me. In fact, like, I mean, one of the big frustrations between him and I was that he was one of the best storytellers I've ever met,
Yeah.
but he didn't want to write. He was, like you said, holding court. He was a
Right,
murderer.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a huge piece of my performance, my desire to perform, that comes from that. But I think even more primal is the telling stories to connect with people is
Yes.
uh is
Yeah.
is at the core of my art making.
Yeah.
It really, whether it's a painting or a music or whatever,
Or sitting
it's
around with your kids. I mean, like your dad did
yeah,
with us, right? That
yeah,
that's it's amazing how powerful that is. I mean, a person who can
yeah,
do that is just, and my father too was very good at this as well. It still is.
yeah,
There's because I mean that's what I mean. What if you think about what you're doing and what I do as a teacher, maybe too, is you're trying to connect with people, and you're trying to
Yeah.
use a kind of maybe a narrative form or an expression of some kind to get something across to someone, and you want a
Yeah.
reaction. Like if you're a real performer, will watch the audience carefully and will look
Totally.
for, right. I mean, Jordan Peterson said something about how when you're giving a speech to a crowd, to a group of people, you don't actually talk to the group. You kind of look around the room and you look into the eyes of people and you scan the room. You're actually talking to individuals, right? So
Yeah.
you may have experienced this as a
So
on stage. I don't know that you actually kind of connect with individual people sometimes. I don't know.
yeah, no, of course you
You know?
do. And it can be really emotional too, like with complete strangers, you know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Unlike your father, right, who obviously is not a stranger. It's you've. So, do you feel do you feel that you've kind of taken what the talents your dad had and kind of you've been able to apply them? Is that maybe too much to say? I don't know. Is that
Not at all. No, man,
yeah?
I'm definitely my father's son. And I would say if anyone recognizes him in me, I would say that's one of the best compliments I could get.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, that's a great place to end. Listen, Mark, this has been really great. I hope this is the beginning of a number of them. I'd like to do quite a number with you because
Dude, it's been a pleasure.
so it's like we haven't spent much time together in the last 20 years or whatever. So it's kind of like it's an excuse for me to hang out with you for an hour.
Yeah.
You know
Well,
what
we
I mean?
can do that anyway. If
Yeah,
anyone else is
definitely. Yeah.
enjoying our conversation, I'm happy to jump on again and make it
Okay. Well,
official.
hopefully,
For sure.
if my girlfriend, we might be going to the Congo in the winter if she has this job or not. But if she doesn't have that, then I want to go to Mexico. So,
I
uh,
mean, life is hard, man.
yeah.
I,
All right, man. So hopefully I'll see you in Mexico, and we'll sign off for
I
now.
would love that.
Okay, bro. Yeah.
Hey, Jay, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah, man. No problem. See ya.